Hello and welcome to episode number 8 of the Scottish History Podcast. My name is Owen and once again, welcome. I also want to apologise for not uploading an episode last week. It's just been such a hectic time recently, so trying to get time to do this, I'm afraid, is few and far between, but I'm here, I'm back with another episode for you. So a couple of weeks ago was the anniversary of the Massacre of Glencoe, which took place on the 13th of February in 1692. So I thought that's a good place to start. Now, the Massacre of Glencoe happened during the beginning of what was known as the Jacobite era in Scotland. The Jacobites we are going to get on to in more depth properly as the more podcast episodes that we do. But we're just going to focus mainly on the Massacre of Glencoe. So you might listen to this and might not quite understand exactly what it is that's going on. The beginning will explain a little bit about what's happened, but over the course of time, things will start to make more sense. So we're just going to kick straight off with it. So the Massacre of Glencoe. King James Stewart, who was King James Stewart the 7th of Scotland and 2nd of England, was a Catholic man. However, Protestantism was the main religion of the time since the Reformation, led by John Knox and Oliver Cromwell in the 16th century. King James had a son that he declared would be brought up a Catholic. People didn't want that. They wanted a Protestant monarchy. Mary Stuart, who was James VII's sister, and her Dutch husband William of Orange were invited to invade Britain on the 30th of June 1688. They arrived on the 5th of November 1688. James had a large and believed significant army, however he refused to fight. He threw the Great Seal of the realm into the River Thames in London and tried to flee to France. He was, however, caught and imprisoned. William, however, did not want James to be considered a martyr, so James was allowed to escape to France and was offered a palace by his cousin and ally, King Louis XIV. A parliament was called and James was deemed to have abdicated, and therefore his sister Mary and brother-in-law William were named the new monarchs of Britain. They became Mary II and William III. A new Bill of Rights was then passed that now stated that a Catholic will never again take the throne of Britain, neither shall a British monarch ever again marry a Catholic. James, however, had the huge support of the Highland clans. Some were fiercely dedicated to James and they were willing to fight for their king, to have him restored onto the throne with the help of France. The Earl of Breadalbane, Slippery John Campbell, known for switching sides constantly, showed allegiance to Mary II and William III by trying to convince the Highland clans to pledge their allegiance to William and Mary. However, there was an element of bribery. Each Highland clan would receive a share of £12,000, which equates to roughly £2.5 million in today's money. So they would receive a share of £12,000 pot for their agreement to sign the oath to William and Mary. The meeting took place on the 30th of June in 1691 at Achalador Castle, just south of Glencoe. Present was Alistair MacIan, the 12th clan chief of the MacDonalds of Glencoe, amongst others. These MacDonalds had fallen on hard times in recent years. They were previously the Lords of the Isles, the descendants of Somerled, but they had lost everything and had now resorted to cattle rustling to make ends meet. They weren't the only clan doing this. The MacGregors, for example, were another. Some of you might have heard of Rob Roy MacGregor, a film made in 1995, around about the same time as Braveheart was made, Liam Neeson, etc. But Rob Roy MacGregor, he too like the McDonald's of the time, were cattle rustlers. But mostly in that area, the cattle that they were rustling belonged to the Campbells. So, of course, the Campbells were not the best of friends with the MacDonalds. Now, Alistair MacIan was related to the Campbells by marriage. The Earl of Breadalbane also reminded MacIan that he owed the Campbells money for the stolen cattle, so MacIan's share of the £12,000 was gone instantly. However, Breadalbane also promised the clans that if James VII ever returned to Scotland to fight, then the oath to William and Mary would be torn up and their support would revert back to James's side. But the chiefs sought permission of James VII first. They wrote a letter to him in France. They didn't want to face trouble from either James or William's side. The deadline for signing the oath to William and Mary was set as the 31st of December in 1691. The clan chiefs held out on signing anything until they had heard from James, because with the backing of the French, James would surely be returned to the throne. James eventually sent a letter back on the 12th of December 1691, advising the clans to sign the oath to William and Mary, as no French backing would come before the turn of the year. The Secretary of State for Scotland was a man called John Dalrymple. John Dalrymple had worked for James but had defected to William and Mary upon James's abdication. Now, John Dalrymple really disliked the Highland clans, with himself being from the Lowlands. Now, James's letter in response, sent from France, was intercepted in London, and at the request of Dalrymple the letter was kept for a few days before being resealed and slowly carried north to Scotland. 10 days before the deadline, the letter had only reached Edinburgh, quite a distance short of its Highland destinations. Some clan chiefs, when they received the letter, even withheld it for a short time from neighbouring clans as a way of potentially embarrassing the clans. Because William had said that if the clans did not sign this oath to them, there would be some serious repercussions. The word finally reached Alistair MacIan, the chief of Glencoe, on the 30th of December. He had 1 day to get to the village of Inveraray, but it was too late. He would never make it to Inveraray. He instead headed over the hills down into Inverlochy, which most people know now as Fort William. But he headed down into Inverlochy / Fort William, where on the 31st of December he met with the governor as Colonel John Hill. Unfortunately, there was not much that Colonel Hill could do for MacIan, but what he did was he wrote MacIan a note to state that MacIan had presented himself to sign the oath on the 31st of December, and he was satisfied of this, that when MacIan arrives in Inveraray, Sir Colin Campbell should receive MacIan's signature in good faith, and the signature should be dated as the 31st of December 1691 to say that MacIan had signed the oath before the deadline. MacIan leaves Fort William at this time of year. You know, it's midwinter, so it's dark, snow, there's cold, it's just horrendous conditions, especially for a reasonably elderly man like MacIan to be walking across in these particular types of conditions. But Alistair MacIan arrived in Inveraray on January the 2nd. However, Sir Colin Campbell, the man he was supposed to meet, he wasn't there. Colin Campbell had left on the 31st of December from Inveraray to celebrate Hogmanay. Hogmanay is a traditional New Year's party that we have in Scotland. I'm hoping to focus on that in a podcast later to explain fully what Hogmanay is, but it's essentially a party that starts on the 31st of December and finished roughly about the 6th of January. So Colin Campbell, he's away celebrating Hogmanay, and he did not return until, believe it or not, the 6th of January. When Colin Campbell arrived back, Alistair McKeon marched straight up to him and demanded to sign the oath. The oath was signed as per the agreement with Colonel John Hill, and the paperwork was sent on to Edinburgh to the Privy Council. John Hill followed this by sending McKeon another letter stating that the MacDonalds of Glencoe were now under the protection of the garrison at Fort William. In Edinburgh, however, the Privy Council, despite the evidence proving otherwise, along with pressure from Dalrymple, McKeon's signature was found to be an illegal late submission and was struck from the record. 5 days after McKeon had signed the oath, Dalrymple found out that McKeon's name had been struck off, and he was absolutely delighted. He now had a clan to make an example of, despite a number of other clans not signing the oath, mostly due to the weather. But Dalrymple, for some reason, also hated the MacDonalds of Glencoe and was glad of this information. Dalrymple wrote many letters forcing William III to act, and despite Colonel Hill's efforts to call for a reprieve for the MacDonalds. Dalrymple ordered Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon, a 60-year-old unsuccessful military man, potentially because he was a heavy drinker and gambler, but he ordered Robert Campbell to advance with 120 soldiers into Glencoe, stay with the MacDonalds for a number of days, and await further instructions. Campbell and his 120 men arrived in Glencoe on the 2nd of February 1692, stating to McKeon that they were just passing through whilst collecting taxes. To McKeon this was plausible, added to the fact that McKeon and Robert Campbell were related by marriage. This also seemed to be a reconciliation between the two clans. The soldiers stayed with the MacDonalds for 12 days, under Highland hospitality. The idea of Highland hospitality is it's not a law, it's an unwritten agreement. Highland hospitality basically means that if you were to invite a stranger into your home and break bread with them, then they became a trusted friend. They were no longer a stranger. So the soldiers stayed with the MacDonalds for 12 days, and on the 12th of February, Campbell of Glenlyon received his instructions from Dalrymple. I'm now going to read the transcript of the order that Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon received. You are hereby ordered to fall upon the rebels, the MacDonalds of Glencoe, and put all to the sword under 70. You are to have a special care that the old fox and his sons do not, upon no account, escape your hands. You are to secure all the avenues that no man escape. This you are to put in execution at 5 of the clock precisely, and by that time, or very shortly after it, I'll strive to be at you with a stronger party. If I do not come to you at 5, you are not to tarry for me, but to fall on. This is by the King's special command, for the good and safety of the country, that these miscreants be cut off root and branch. See that this be put in execution without feud or favour, else you may expect to be dealt with as one not true to king nor government, nor a man fit to carry commission in the king's service. Expecting you will not fail in the fulfilling hereof, as you love yourself, I subscribe these with my hand at Bacchus, February 12th, 1692. So the orders were very plain and simple. At 5 a.m. the following day, on the 13th of February 1692, Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon and his 120 men were to kill every member of the MacDonald clan under the age of 70 years old. And it was the following morning, 5 a.m, on the button, on the 13th of February 1692, amongst the snow blizzard and the dead of night, that Captain Robert Campbell and his army of 120 men carried out their orders. McKeon was shot twice in his bedroom by Robert Campbell whilst he was putting on his trews to see what all the commotion was about. McKeon's 2 sons were, however, able to flee. Officially, the toll of the massacre that took place on that day claimed the lives of 38 men, women and children. However, of the many to flee, some died of exposure from the winter temperatures, and anywhere up to between 40 and up to 300 clanspeople died as a result of exposure. At that time, it is believed that about 1,000 people lived in Glencoe, so for only 38 to be killed directly at the massacre indicates that perhaps a lot of the soldiers refused to carry out their orders. By the time that night had fallen, the soldiers and everyone had disappeared. Any nearby survivors came out of hiding and down to the village to begin burying the dead. Alistair McKeon was buried on the MacDonald's burial island of Eilean Mundy on Loch Leven, a short distance away from Glencoe. Dalrymple was furious to find out that McKeon's 2 sons had survived, and he wrote many letters urging the survivors to be hunted and killed. However, no one responded to his calls. Glenlyon and his men were soon to be found in Edinburgh talking of the massacre, and one night a drunken Glenlyon lost the written order for the attack in a bar. The orders were found and immediately sent to France and published in the Paris Gazette. From there, the news spread like wildfire all over Europe and, of course, back into Britain. The slippery Earl of Breadalbane received news of it and was horrified. Not just because he was a Campbell and could clearly see the Campbells were going to take the blame for the massacre, because he thought that he too would be blamed. So he wrote to the MacDonalds of Glencoe asking for them to absolve himself and his clan from any responsibility for the massacre. Still to this day, he has received no response. King William at this point was fighting in Flanders and France, and due to the news, his wife, Queen Mary, began to ask questions of Parliament of what had been going on. By the following year, 1693, William was forced into holding an official inquiry into the massacre. However, by the end of it, it involved everyone, including the king, being exonerated. 2 years later, in 1695, the year following the death of Mary II, a second inquiry was held, but this time William would not be allowed to interfere. But once again, William was exonerated. Dalrymple, however, was sacked as Secretary of State, and the slippery Earl of Breadalbane was charged with treason, but later released. The worst off was Robert Campbell and his officers that had served with him on that day. They were charged with slaughter under trust. They were all to stand trial, but no such trials ever came to fruition. The MacDonalds moved back to Glencoe, and McKeon's oldest son, John, became the 13th Chief of Glencoe, building his home on the site where his fathers had stood. Should Clan Campbell really have deserved the blame here? Let me know. Use Facebook, Twitter, send me a little email on any of the media that this podcast has. Please let me know, what are your feelings behind the Massacre of Glencoe. Some of you might recognise a little bit of that story because you might be fans, of a certain little show called Game of Thrones. Something happens in Game of Thrones known as the Red Wedding. The Red Wedding is a mixture of 2 stories from Scottish history taken and amalgamated into one story. Those stories are The Black Dinner, which takes place in Edinburgh Castle, which we'll cover, and the Massacre of Glencoe. Once again, folks, I'd just like to thank you very much for listening. Please keep listening. It's the main thing. Our statistics have been absolutely fantastic. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Deezer, all of these sorts of places, Acast, etc. And you can search us on our website. Our website is Scott History Pod, all one word. So it's scotthistorypod.libsyn, libsyn.com. You can also find us on Facebook. Just look for the Scottish History Podcast. On Twitter, at Scott History Pod. And by email, it's scotthistorypod@gmail.com. Once again, folks, thank you very much for listening to episode number 8 of the Scottish History Podcast. I've been Owen Innes, and I'll see you next time.